lovers, welcome back. Today I'm going to be reviewing all the books that I finished in January. I feel like my January was taken up with quite a few books that you're not going to see here today because I didn't quite finish them in time, but I thought we would keep things simple. I'll address those in the next roundup. We'll just talk about the books that I actually did finish. All in all, I've had a very good start to my reading year. I think there could be a favourite of the year in here, and just generally some very good books that I really enjoyed. Starting with Butcher's Crossing by John Williams. This was the first book I read this year and I loved it. As you can see, it's been decorated with permission. She did ask, just as Williams intended his anti-Western, I'm sure, with unicorn stickers. So John Williams wrote the much loved Stoner. I have been making my way through his work since I read Stoner. There's only 4 books. I have one left, but he did say he wasn't particularly proud of his debut, so I'm not expecting as much as I did from his later novels. So I've kind of read all the major ones now, and they're all pretty different from one another, but all quite fantastic. I do love Stoner. It's been a few years since I read it, so this may be an overstatement, but I think I love Butcher's Crossing even more. I think it was so interesting, and there's so much I could say about it if I went into a deep dive on the text. But in brief, it is an anti-Western. It is said to have inspired the likes of Cormac McCarthy, etc., and sort of usher in a new age of kind of realistic Westerns that more properly showed the brutality rather than the sort of adventuring vibes. So it's about Will Andrews. He is a Harvard lad and he abandons his life in Massachusetts and heads down to the frontier to Butcher's Crossing in Kansas. He's quite vague about his reasoning for this. I don't think he fully understands it, nor do we. He wants to get to know the country. He wants to be in the wilderness. He's inspired by Emerson. So he's got quite romantic notions, I think, of what the West will be like. And also, I think he's kind of hoping to find a sense of self. You know, he's a young man. And he realises that the only way to really get out into the wilderness, as it were, is to take part in and finance a buffalo hunt. So he comes across this hunter called Miller, who is a rather strange character from the off. And Miller talks of this valley he once visited, which he claims he felt like he was the first person to ever set foot there. And he thinks there are buffalo there in numbers like they were in the old times. So if Will Andrews was particularly interested in hunting buffalo, which he's not really, he's actually too late. By the time this novel is set, most of the buffalo population has been hunted and killed for their hides in a sort of catastrophic way. You know, a few years after this book was set, there were less than 100 buffalo left in the wild. Miller doesn't have to do much persuading to get Andrews to front the money for this expedition to this valley, and we follow them on this journey. One thing I love about Williams, and I think other people do too, is his restraint, and it is so well done in this particular book. It adds to the tension of the book. You know, we're always waiting for the bad thing to happen. It kind of lurks just outside the text. It really increases also the horror and the revulsion, really, of the piece. We, the reader, just don't understand how these men cannot see that what they're doing is so destructive and also so pointless. You know, in Stoner, the restraint serves to sort of increase the sort of resonance of some of the emotional highs and lows, but in this one it creates that sense of horror. Particularly, I think, in the character of Andrews. Even though we are very much in his point of view throughout, you know, we are given insight into his thoughts and feelings, if he has feelings, but we don't know him, and neither does he. And there's this real sense of emptiness that pours off him, off the other characters in the book, this kind of void, this unfillable void that they try to fill with all this destruction. And it's obviously an impossible endeavour. And I liked that about this book, that we keep that distance from the characters and from Andrews even himself. Bret Easton Ellis says in the introduction to this one that very few writers successfully find the magical balance, the alchemy that is a fusion of plain spoken simplicity that becomes the complexly lyrical. The American writer John Williams is one of those rare stylists who achieved this, most notably in Stoner, but I also think he achieves it here. It's a really good combination of sentences and prose and paragraphs and sections which just forward the narrative and the story, with sort of slightly higher register, more sublime passages even, which I just love about his work. And, you know, the combination of the two things really does give it rhythm, and it, you know, elevates it. So yeah, I love this novel. I think it's perfectly balanced, really masterfully done. Yeah, like I said, it exhibits that restraint, which I think is so hard to do well, and I think Williams does it so well, and I just really enjoyed reading it throughout. I found it so compelling, kind of that tension that he builds all across the book. Highly recommend this one. I will definitely be returning to this, and if I can get away with it, writing something more detailed about it. Okay, this next book I had so much fun with. I just enjoyed the reading of this so much. It's The Long Ships by Frans G. Bengtsson, who was a Swedish author, and it's translated by Michael Meyer. Let's take a closer look at that cover because I love it. Very cool NYRB cover. So this is a Swedish novel from the 1940s. It follows a Viking named Orm Tosterson. He is nicknamed Red Orm, and I think the Swedish is called Red Orm. And he's nicknamed that for both his hair colour and also his temperament in battle. So the book is split into like 4 books. I think it was originally 2 volumes of 2 books each. And in each one, obviously, he does something slightly different. It's kind of a self-contained story, because it's in the style of an Icelandic saga. I'm hoping to reread The Greenlanders soon this month. I've been saying that for like a couple months now, but this is the month, and I'm very much looking forward to comparing the two. I mean, the 2 books I want to say are very different, Greenlanders and this one, which is interesting considering they adopt a similar form, or they're based on the same form in fact. And yeah, I do love a book in the style of an Icelandic saga, I gotta say. Obviously it's very different from what we think of in terms of like your 19th century, 20th century, year 21st century novel. The characters are a little bit more flat. It's more about, you know, propulsive action. We're not afforded a lot of interiority for our characters. They can be repetitive because, you know, they in turn were inspired by oral narratives. They had these kind of like set pieces. But this one is a lot of fun. The Greenlanders is quite a lot more dense, but this one is really readable. You know, I absolutely flew through its 500 pages. It's a well-balanced book. I would say that Bengtsson does use a few 20th century novelistic techniques in here, which just serve to kind of freshen it up and update it so it doesn't feel too repetitive or heavy or dense or whatever. It's a really well balanced book, so there are more domestic and intimate moments to balance out some of the more kind of warrior fighting moments. I hate like action scenes in films. I find them deadly boring, with just a few notable exceptions if they're really done in kind of with true artistry. I don't tend to favour lots of action-packed narratives in my novels either. And The Greenlanders kind of takes the opposite approach. That really is much more about kind of daily life and minutiae. And this one does have the big action scenes, but they're just nicely balanced. There's not too much of them. And like I say, we get other more quiet moments as well. And he just has a gift for storytelling. It's just a story in the old-fashioned sense of a story. And we get lots of like mini stories within the larger narrative because they come across characters who will sit down and tell their story. And all of them are engaging, all of them are compelling, and it adds enough variation as well to the story. I think possibly maybe in the very last book I was thinking, okay, it's getting a little repetitive now, but that's really like, you know, 400 pages in to a 500-page book. That happens with many 500-page books that exist in the world. And it's so interesting. As a Viking warrior, Orm travels all over the place. So he travels obviously in his native Scandinavia. Then he travels through Northern Europe, parts of Ireland, parts of England. He travels all the way down to Spain. And his encounters with Christianity, Islam and Judaism are interesting, and the dynamics that Bengtsson chooses to sort of highlight. I think it's sensitively done, especially for a 1940s book. and very interesting. And then they also travel kind of more into Eastern Europe as well in that sense, and this depiction of, 10th century the world. It was really fascinating. Obviously it's not wholly historically accurate, but just even the little bits that I did pick up, I was so interested in. I'm reading a lot, I think, of Middle Ages books. They're all kind of hundreds of years apart from one another, but still they have interesting sort of overlaps in terms of like theming and ideas. So I just finished Meanwood, which I'll talk about next in the next roundup, and obviously I'm going to read the Greenlanders. So I feel like I've been enjoying reading these close together, and I must say that the translation is impeccable. It reads like it could have been written in English. Obviously I can't read the Swedish, so I don't know how not faithful it is, but whatever the case may be, Bengtsson plus Meyer together have made an extremely entertaining book for English readers of English. I think crucially Meyer has managed to capture the humour of the original, which I think is in the original, and it is the humour that makes this book so lovable. It's got these like little wry asides, and it just makes the book lighter, so it's not just a selection of deeds or whatever. It makes it engaging and fun, and the narrative voice is fun to read. And that's also what I think sort of draws the slightly kind of flat saga-ish characters out into three-dimensionality, and it makes you care, and it makes for like some poignant moments too, like when that humour disappears, you can see like what matters to these characters as well. It's a witty book, and that's something the Greenlanders doesn't have. So again, I'm really interested to compare the two of them. If you're thinking to yourself, I don't want to read a Viking book, please consider it. I really do recommend it. Michael Chabon said in the introduction to this that he thinks it's a novel which has the potential to please every literate human being in the entire world. And I don't know about that, but I don't think it's far wrong. It is just interesting, fun, compelling, unusual, I suppose, compared to most of what we read these days, and I highly recommend it. Oh, final thing as well, what I quite like about what Bengtsson does is undermines and sort of writes back to some of the sort of potential propagandizing about Vikings, as these like, macho, nationalistic peoples. That's not to say that they are not, they don't have forms of their own masculinity and stuff like that, but I think this book doesn't reinforce some of those irritating tropes about Vikings. So yeah, there's some surprising moments in here. So overall, highly recommend. So I also read the Odyssey by Homer, and I read the Emily Wilson translation, and I feel like it has some nice, obviously because books like The Long Ships have the Odyssey in mind. I'm pretty sure he said he wanted to write something enjoyable like The Three Musketeers and the Odyssey, which I think he really does. And I didn't realise how enjoyable the Odyssey would be for me as well. He's right, it is enjoyable. Thank you, Bengtsson. I'm always a little tentative around classics, like proper classics like Greek and Roman classics. I think because of the sort of cultural associations, implications, discourse that surrounds them, the ways they have been sort of theorised about and talked about and disseminated through culture, maybe in a similar way to like, Vikings have a certain reputation, certainly among sort of communities we might not agree with necessarily. I feel like Greek classics has that in a slightly different way, but it has that association for me. It has been propagandized as well, let's say, and also lends itself to sort of literary snobbery, this kind of thing. But of course, I've done myself a massive disservice because the book itself, the text itself, or the poem itself rather, is so much stranger, more interesting than what it gets watered down to or reduced down to. And it's actually really enjoyable. I really enjoyed reading it. So I read this not because Christopher Nolan is coming out with a film, yeah, help us, but because we're reading Ulysses in book club later this year, and I thought, I gotta read the Odyssey first, I have to. And I thought it would be kind of a slog, but it wasn't. As I say, I actually was surprised by how much I enjoyed it. I mean, sure, it is still an, extremely old text, so it's not like sitting down with Butcher's Crossing. When you read this kind of thing as well, it's interesting from a historical perspective, not just like historical as in the time in which it was written, but in the ways it's been received for the last couple thousand years. All of it just makes it interesting to read, I think. Anyway, so, and I also had a sort of a sense of what I thought the text would be like. You know, I thought it'd be action-packed. We'd been moving from incident to incident. I thought we'd be encountering a lot of quite obscure mythological creatures, which I would need to know stuff about. I thought it would be like a lot of pains to being a heroic man and, you know, honour and, you know, journeying out there and killing a bunch of people. And obviously that was all in my head, because actually it was a much more intimate portrayal than I was expecting. As with the long ships, there's balance here between the sort of bigger conflict scenes versus the hearthside domestic scenes. For example, there's a moment in here where someone does laundry. I mean, fascinating from a historical perspective, from a literary perspective, like why choose to put that in there, why make that part of the story. And the bit I thought of as the Odyssey, from what I picked up here and there, him, you know, fighting the Cyclops and having all of his men turned into pigs by Circe and you know, being tempted by nymphs and all of that kind of stuff, that literally takes up like 4 books of this 24-book poem. And it's narrated by Odysseus in the past tense, first person, so he's telling people about it, which makes it so interesting. And in general, I thought formally there were so many interesting things about this which still felt modern, still felt fresh. And whether that's just always been the way of our stories and I associate it with contemporary writing, or a contemporary approach to storytelling, or whether it comes directly from specifically the Odyssey. The way it kind of scene changes or like cuts feels very cinematic sometimes. The way it sort of starts away from Odysseus and kind of comes closer to him. I don't think we meet him for quite a few books. We start with his son, and we start kind of in the middle of the story. Just realised I had the blind half down and now I've put it up so we can have a brighter experience. It's actually sunny outside today. That'll be the light change you just perceived, maybe. I suppose we have to talk translation. I went with the Wilson because I read a Substack piece from her which more or less described like how she approaches translation. I was impressed by it. I bought into her approach, like how she knows nothing in English is going to be anything like the ancient Greek, but that she tried to capture the feel of the text. I feel like this is very important to me. I've been thinking a lot about translation recently, and the fact that she tried to capture its not simplicity, it's not quite the right word, but the fact of it not being kind of really decadent and over the top. She tried to capture something rhythmical and something of a similar length compared to some of the other translations. And I do think she's probably right when she says that some of the stranger and more uncanny elements of this poem are revealed actually by not trying to kind of cover it up or smooth it over with archaisms or, you know, using high register language. And I enjoyed reading it. The controversy, yeah, just reeks of misogyny to me. There's no reason why we can't have a translation like this out in the world. I do think I will read other translations in my lifetime. I'm sure they're beautiful in their own right and for their own reasons. You know, I'm not fully beholden to this one next time I approach the Odyssey, but I liked it, and I liked her translator's note and her introduction in here. I thought they were really helpful and useful and fascinating. I just find translation very fascinating. So I highly recommend. Enjoyed it so much more than I thought I would. And now I'm slightly more prepared for Ulysses. Next we have The Invention of Morel by Adolfo Bioy Casares. And to contextualise him, this was published in 1940 and he was a close friend of Borges. He was quite a lot younger than Borges, but he was a close friend over the course of his life, and he was an Argentinian writer, so kind of part of that earlier Latin American set. So I don't want to reveal too much of this text because it kind of reveals itself to you over the course of it. It reminded me of books like My Death by Lisa Tuttle and Pedro Paramo by Juan Rulfo, and yeah, which makes it difficult to review without really breaking it down and getting into it. Luckily, I got to discuss it in more depth and detail in book club, but if you liked either of those 2 books, and you like that kind of atmospheric, strange, doesn't have all the answers, but is thought-provoking kind of novel which sits on a genre and literary boundary, I think you'll like this one. In brief, it opens with a fugitive. He's running from the authorities in his native Venezuela, who is living on an island. It's a stranger island which has weird rumours about a disease that plagues its shores, and nobody lives there apart from him. And on it are a museum, a chapel, and a swimming pool. And one day he's kind of resting there, and he's suddenly surrounded by a lot of people that seem to have appeared from nowhere, and he runs down off the hill with the museum, etc. on it, into the marshland, and there he begins this diary. So it's in first person. Now, obviously something's going on the island. You'll have to read it to find out what that is. This wasn't a resounding success for all of us in book club, partly because of one of the major, I think, plot points in it, and the protagonist himself not being super likeable. Partly because I think also it's an older novel, obviously, and we are more familiar with some of the more updated riffs on this kind of thing. But I definitely appreciated it for what it is, and I think there are lots of readers out there who would really enjoy it. I think there was some really arresting imagery in there. I did find it to be very thought-provoking in terms of what it asks. I found it to be scarily prescient in some ways. I enjoyed following the sort of puzzle mystery aspect of it, and I think Bioy really creates a very sort of layered effect in terms of the meanings of the book. And I think it would reward rereadings as well. So yeah, I enjoyed. I would recommend it. Definitely one for, it's quite different stylistically, but one for fans of Borges and for fans of Latin American fiction in general. Also the novels that I just mentioned, or indeed this next novel. I reread Piranesi, and I get asked all the time about books similar to Piranesi. So I know it's Piranesi, by the way, but like in my brain it's Piranesi forever. And by Susanna Clarke. And this is one of my all-time favourite novels, and my reread this month confirmed it once again for me. But yeah, I reread this, and we read it in general in conversation with Morel, because the two have some really interesting overlapping ideas and themes. They're not exactly similar in many, many ways, but they are so interesting to read in conversation with one another. So if you've read Piranesi, I really recommend going and reading Morel. I think even if you don't enjoy Morel that much, it's interesting to see the ways the two books talk to each other. If you've not read either book, I think I would read this one first, then this one, but I think either way you would have an enjoyable time. And of course, if you read and like Morel, you should read Piranesi. You should read Piranesi anyway, because I love it. I don't want to repeat myself every time I read this book, because I've obviously reviewed it a couple times already, and I will leave links to my original reviews on my Substack, on the Substack version of this post. But I just love it. I just think it's such a perfect whole of a book. Everything about it just ties together so nicely. Like, on the one hand, it's just very enjoyable. There's a mystery element to it. That's like fun to puzzle together. There's a really lovable main character, and sort of whenever I say that, I always feel like I'm sort of doing him a disservice, like making him sound too sweet, or just making it sound kind of corny or cheesy somehow. But he is, a human being, but he's one we can really empathise with and feel for. The plotting is good, the pacing is good. So on those fronts, like, is this an entertaining novel? Yes, but also it is a thought-provoking book as well. Like, what does the house mean? How do these clashes of knowledges work? And yeah, it's best to go into it not knowing too much of the plot, so I won't go into that. But it just works on so many levels, and everything just meshes and knits together so nicely, whilst at the same time being really readable and moving. And yeah, it's special. It's a very special book. And I think because Morel has this kind of child in Piranesi, it makes me like Morel more as well. Even though it's more troublesome, even though it's more fraught with difficulties that I don't think Clarke has to face. Like, for example, Bioy's relationship with women. It makes me like Morel more. So anyway, read them together. It was very rewarding, and I had a very good time doing so. Okay, very briefly on Blackwater 2, The Levee by Michael McDowell. I did say I was going to stop reviewing series, especially series where I sort of feel like we're very much in the middle of the story, and this has got like 6 volumes or something, so we're very much in the middle of the story, and I feel like I can't fully evaluate it. I mean, it needs to be evaluated as a whole, but suffice it to say, I enjoyed this one, I think, even more than the first. I feel like it expanded the world and the characters more. I feel like McDowell, for a horror writer, is really good at getting nuanced human dynamics into a very short page count. And there's some like couple of truly horrifying scenes in here. It's not horror as you would expect it. There's not a lot of horror. It's really about the dynamics of the people that live in this town. So it's set in Perdido, Alabama in the 1950s. So obviously it was written in the 1980s. I think the way it treats with race and the black characters in the novel in the more overt ways, I think it is sort of actively writing against the prejudices of the Deep South in the 1950s. But I think in the subtle ways that horror writers of the 1980s were often subject to, it isn't as successful. So it's something to be wary of going into these books. There's even a little note at the front of these. So yeah, I think what I'm saying is McDowell has some blind spots that I don't think he's aware of, but in other ways he's kind of tackling it. Anyway, yeah, so it's set in Perdido, Alabama in the 1950s, and in the first book there was this really big flood, essentially the embodiment of the river that caused the flood, or that experienced the flood. Eleanor Caskey comes out of the water and takes part in human life, and she ends up with a mother-in-law that's very suspicious of her and hates her, and she's causing chaos, basically subtly causing chaos in the town. And this one obviously deals with a levee, which she is not particularly happy about, as one can imagine, as she embodies the river. That's Blackwater, and I will keep going with it and let you know what I think about it kind of as a whole. But yes, that is all for now. I hope you enjoyed this video. So thank you for watching. Bye.